My name is Sarah Johnson, and I'm with the Disabled Rights Action Committee. The Disabled Rights Action Committee was formed back in the late 80s, early 90s. We're a group that fights for equal access for people with disabilities. We take a nonviolent direct action approach to changing the system. We have gone up to Capitol Hill. We have gone to DC to legislate with our representatives. However, if we feel the conversation isn't going well, or we feel our needs aren't being heard, we have taken direct action in many different ways. The most successful one being the bus blocks that were done back in the 90s, where basically we rolled our wheelchairs to block access to the tracks trains, to the buses, and shut down the bus system until they agreed to make every last bus and train in Utah fully accessible. And now we do have a fully accessible UTA system. So in talking about different types of disability, it's important to note that not all disability is the same. Most people are aware of accessibility needs for people in a wheelchair, and that tends to be where the conversation ends for a lot of people on disability. But there are many different categories of disability. There are those with visual impairments, those with mobility impairments that may not use a wheelchair or may use a wheelchair only part of the time, but are still fairly ambulatory also. Then we also have a whole category of neurodivergent disabilities, or basically ways that the brain functions outside what we look at as kind of your neurotypical or normal brain function. So we're talking about people that might be on the autism spectrum. That could include people with epilepsy. There are a number of physical conditions that can cause temporary or permanent brain disruptions. I myself, with my Sjogren's syndrome, sometimes experience brain fog. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're recognizing that these aren't just physical limitations, that sometimes there are mental disabilities that come in with that as well. Dyslexia would be another one. I was originally diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis at 18 months. At the time, the doctors didn't think you could get arthritis so young. They thought of it as an old person's disease. I was originally diagnosed with cerebral palsy, and if it hadn't been for my mother noticing that I reacted in a very strange and painful way to the treatment, they wouldn't have necessarily tested for arthritis. My mother insisted that they test for arthritis, and they found out that's what it was. Now there are quite a few children that are diagnosed with having early stage arthritis that they were born with. Since that time, I have collected a number of other autoimmune disorders. This tends to happen once you have one autoimmune disorder. It's not unusual to acquire others. I currently have Sjogren's syndrome, where my moisture-producing glands are under attack. I also have celiac disease, where my body doesn't absorb nutrients, and that's because of a gluten allergy I have. Disability language can be a little tricky, and I think it's trickier for the average non-disabled individual. A lot of people look at disability as a negative. By its very nature, it is the lack of. I am very proud to be disabled. I embrace my disability, and I acknowledge that it's part of my identity and part of what's made me a stronger, more resilient, and more complex thinker. There are a lot of people that have moved towards person-first language. This was a large trend a couple decades ago where you identified the person first and then referred to the disability, people with disabilities. But as we're seeing more people embracing their disability, not as an impairment, but rather as a strength, we are seeing them embrace disabled person. It really ends up depending on the individual and how they identify with their disability, where they are with the acceptance of their disability. Obviously, language can be very hurtful, and for a number of us, we've taken those hurtful terms and given them a new life. For me, I was called every name in the book: cripple, retard, gimp, you name it. I now identify as what we call a cripple punk. This is somebody that embraces their disability, doesn't in any way strive to change it or adapt to meet society, but rather demands that society adapts to meet my needs. And again, nobody should ever feel that they have to share their disability. If you're asked for information on your disability at a job hunt or while trying to secure housing, that is absolutely against the law, and you should not have to put up with that. You can report that kind of discrimination to the Disability Law Center or other organizations that can help you with that. That's a form of discrimination for people with disabilities. However, if we're talking about a friend, somebody you know, that would be an okay conversation to get into. I've had a number of people try to approach me in the grocery store. That's a little bit inappropriate. However, children don't always know the rules, and I've had a number of children ask their parents. And when I hear those questions, I try to answer the child as truthfully as I can, but then put the impetus of education back on their parent. Well, you see, I have arthritis, and I'll bet your mom would love to tell you a little bit more about that when she gets home. It's important that you're not shutting down the conversation or shaming it or making it seem like it's inappropriate, but you're at the same time trying to teach somebody that maybe it's not their business and they should do the research themselves. Conversations around disabilities can be very important, but can be very problematic as well. Nobody should ever be asking you about your disability in a job interview or while applying for housing. If these questions get brought up during that process, this is against the law. You should seek legal counsel. This is absolute discrimination if those questions are asked. Nobody ever has to disclose their disability at any point. You are absolutely able to ask for any accommodation, but it's usually a good idea to ask for those after you've been hired. If you feel that you have been marginalized, you can reach out to the Disability Law Center. They deal with a lot of discriminatory actions. When it comes to housing, again, you shouldn't be denied a place to live because of a disability. So if you have a landlord that is asking you how you get around or what needs you have, that's an inappropriate question for a landlord to ask. Should you have certain requirements, there are a number of organizations that can help make a home more accessible for you and can help you research what are the options. But again, it's a struggle to find accessible housing in Utah, especially when we have only a few units, and I as a disabled person might apply for them, get one that's wheelchair accessible, but then the next person on the list actually needs the wheelchair accessible aspect where I might not need that level of accommodation. It can be hard to know what level of accommodations you need, and sadly our government is a little colorblind on where that line is. There are several great resources for people with disabilities looking for accessible housing. It's a good place to always start at the Salt Lake County or Salt Lake City Housing Authority. In fact, the Salt Lake County Housing Authority has given us space to hold our DRAC board meetings. So come to a board meeting and then ask some questions while you're there. In addition, there's the Utah Independent Living Center, which is located near the Salt Lake County Housing Authority. There's also TURN, Volunteers of America. I know Shriners helps a lot with people with disabilities. And there are several other organizations. If you Google disability housing, you'll find a number of links that can help. The keywords I look for when I'm on a website will be ADA compliance, accommodations, special needs sometimes, although I am not a fan of that particular term. There's nothing special about me just because I'm disabled, and I find it to be a little bit condescending when someone describes me as special. But I do look for those terms to be inclusive, and they're typically found towards the bottom of a screen and have a clickable link. Some of the greatest challenges we face in our work is finding accommodating housing for people with disabilities. Disabled Rights Action Committee actually does fair housing surveys where we go out to new apartments, new rental properties, and test to make sure they do have accessible apartments available. When we do these testings, we're not necessarily testing just the ADA specific apartments, but we're looking to make sure that any apartment is accessible. This is an idea we call visitability. And it's important that as we see more people with disabilities, and we're seeing disability taking a more active role in our society, that we have this idea that you can visit anyone and still feel like you can get in. Visitability is the idea that when you go to your friend's house, you have access to get into the living room and use the bathroom while you're there. And this is something we're trying to push with most housing projects. If you'd like to help advocate for people with disabilities, it's important to talk to your congresspeople about making sure that any new housing projects are addressing issues of accessibility. When we're looking at city planning, accessibility should be the first question plans are meeting. In addition, you can always join Disabled Rights Action Committee in our work. You can call us with any questions, concerns you might have. We're always willing to help. And it's important to remember that we are the only marginalized group that is always taking new members. Our group consists of every gender, every disability, every race, every religion, every creed, every nationality. At any point in time, any person can find themselves disabled. For more information or to get help from Disabled Rights Action Committee, you can contact us at disabledrightsactiondrac.org. I think it's important to remember that a lot of our legislators don't understand what it's like to live with a disability. So I try to make sure that I go up to the Hill and share my experience as much as I can. I'm the expert in this area. And until I go up and talk about how these housing projects are affecting me personally, I don't really feel we will see a lot of changes in our laws and a lot of accommodations being made. Any person can go up and talk to their legislature, write them an email, call them on the phone. They need to hear from you about what it is you need in your living situation.